Right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what is the second in our series of webinars on the theme of life after lockdown. And hopefully you can all see on your screen the title of this afternoon's webinar, which is Employment Taxes and Law Update. I'm hoping you can also see a slide of me on screen. And more importantly, at the foot of the screen, you can see our two speakers today, Lee Mutter, who's Head of Employment Taxes at UNW, and Jean-Pierre van Zyl, who's Head of Employment at Square One Law. I've had a look at the list of registered attendees. Some of you may recognize me from previous UNW employment taxes updates, but for those who don't know me, my name is Charles Lineker, and I'm one of the tax partners at UNW. There are actually 5 of us, and you may know some of the others. Mark Hetherington, our specialist VAT partner, David Ward, who's our lead corporate tax partner, also does a lot of R&D work, and heading the whole show, literally, as well as actually, because he's taller than the rest of us, is Steve Lant, who is head of tax and a real polymath, or in layman's terms, a right know-all. I expect, like me and my colleagues, you've been working from home over these last few weeks. I'm actually speaking to you from just outside Carlisle. That's not because this is where the family farm is located and I've run away up here for the duration. Outside Carlisle is where I actually live. And indeed, it's a curious fact that although we're a Newcastle-based firm, 3 of the tax partners actually live in Cumbria, because Mark Hetherington and David Ward also live there, and Lee Mutter actually lives in Hexham. So there's actually only Steve who lives in Newcastle itself. Speaking of Lee, Lee has been in tax for 28 years now. He's specialised in employment taxes for more than 20 of those years, and he's been with UNW for the last 10. And this is actually the 9th employment taxes update that we've done. And those of you who've attended any of the previous ones will know that they've all been at breakfast time. And in recent years, they've been at the Tyneside Cinema. So this is actually the first time, not only that we've done one online, but we've done it in the afternoon. So as has generally been the case, we have a guest speaker. And as I've already said, that is Jean-Pierre, or JP for short, which is a good set of initials to have for someone learned in the law. I expect probably he gets known by some others as the magistrate. As I said, JP is Head of Employment Law at Square One Law. They're a specialist commercial law firm in Newcastle, and JP will probably say a little bit more about Square One Law and the sort of work that he's been doing when it comes on to his slot. But we're delighted he's able to join us this afternoon. And Lee's going to start, but before I hand over to him, just a couple of housekeeping points, which usually if we were in the Tyneside Cinema would be about the fire alarm and making sure you'd switched off your mobile phones. In this case, if you look at the bottom of your screen, hopefully you will notice an icon headed Q&A. And if a question comes into your mind during either of the speakers while they're talking, if you just want to click on that icon and type out the question, then we'll add that to the list of questions we've already got for the Q&A session at the end of the 2 speakers. And the other icon I'll just draw your attention to is one that says chat. And that means that if you hit any technical difficulties or any problems, you could put a little note on that, and hopefully one of our backroom people will pick that up and deal with your question. So I am now going to mute my microphone and stop my video, as I must have been told countless times over the last 24 hours is what I need to do, which means that when I've done that, I will disappear off screen, and hopefully Lee Mutter, the first of our 2 speakers, will appear shortly after.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate that introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Just before I do start, just a couple of things there. Please don't adjust your video settings. You probably realize there's a difference between the way I look on screen as opposed to that photograph, which was probably taken 7 or 8 years ago. So please don't adjust it at the moment. It is me. It's not my badly dressed older brother. The other thing, what I would like to do is just to give a couple of thank yous before I start. First of all, to our marketing team, Richard, Maxine, and Daniel, for putting these together. As probably some of you will know, we normally put these on at the Tyneside Cinema, and we're actually going to do 2 this year at the end of April. One at the Tyneside Cinema in Newcastle, and one at the Great North Air Ambulance premises in Stockton. Unfortunately, they couldn't go ahead in April, but we've done quite a lot of work putting together that, and it was a really sad situation to cancel those. You'd be pleased to know that the actual theme this year was another rip-roaring film that we normally do. This one was around Top Gun, so it was a little bit disappointing that we didn't get that going this year, but hopefully this is going to make up for that. The second thank you is to all those attendees who are actually dialing in today or taking part in this today. It's a beautiful day outside, and I'm sure the last thing you want to do if you are working from home and you are enjoying the sunshine is to watch an employment taxes and employment law update. But hopefully we'll make it worth your while as we go through. So again, just thank you very much for taking part in this. When I was thinking about putting this together, what I was thinking of was the sort of themes that have been emerging in the last 2 months, and the sort of questions and queries and advice that I've been given to employers and to clients and to non-clients as well. Hopefully we've been receiving some of our updates which have been sending through on the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme. But the 2 main areas that I thought would actually be really, really interesting would be, what would be the considerations when we've been in lockdown, and what are the themes that have been developing around that? And the first one would be around working at home. What sort of considerations have you got to think about that, expenses and benefits, and what employees have been thinking about? Second of all, a little bit around furlough claims. I'm not going to go into great detail around the furlough claim process. I think that's probably been done to death in a lot of webinars, and there's a lot of information out there. A lot of people have been doing claims now. There's a few stats out there around how many claims employers have done. But also the other themes around reduction in HM revenue and customs activity. So what have we seen around, what have they been doing, what's behind the scenes? The second part of this is to look a little bit further and to think about, now we're coming out a little bit around lockdown. What does it mean for some employers? What does it mean in terms of their workload, their restructuring? But what does it mean from employment taxes point of view? What are the implications coming through from that with restructuring, with employers who maybe haven't got enough work on at the moment? Thinking around the changes that are coming in place. Is working from home a new norm? What will happen to change to employees' working patterns? But what does that mean for expenses policy? What does that mean for travel and subsistence? What does that mean for expenses? Things around that. So things to think about for the future. And also, finally, the increase in HM revenue customs compliance activity. It's a flip side to the reduction, because obviously there's been a lot of government support for employers and for self-employed people. That's led to a lot of debt with the government. So how do we actually pay that back? Part of that is HM revenue customs activity. What will they do once the lockdown is over and actually they want to start bringing in employment taxes, national insurance? So they're the things that we'll be dealing with today. So first of all, let's have a look at working at home. I think it's quite clear that there's been a major change since the end of March as to how people have worked generally. Whereas before there was a little bit around flexibility of workforce and certain people working from home and some working arrangements were there, it wasn't the norm. But what we've seen since 23rd of March is a lot more people working at home. Zoom meetings have become the norm. Microsoft Teams has been used quite a lot. It's very different to what we're used to. Now, a lot of employees have actually been incurring some household expenses, additional household expenses that they wouldn't have normally incurred. And some employers will actually want to reimburse those employees. Some will not, but some will have expenses policies which enable them to, some will not. So there's a little bit around what employees are expecting, a little bit around expenses that employees have been incurring. obviously there is a choice there between employers reimbursing. If they are going to reimburse, what sort of things should they be reimbursing? Because the sort of things that employees' expenses have been incurring are things such as broadband, printers, setup costs around the working at home, such as electricity, heat, light, water. Some people might have had to pay more insurances because they are working from home and it's actually not covered on the existing insurance. Also, what about their own mobile phones? Some employees will have been making business calls on their own mobile phones. And again, how did they get reimbursed for that? Now, depending on how you do it, will depend on whether you're going to have to tax it or whether you can pay those tax-free. And you've basically got, if you reimburse them, you've got two options. The first option is to reimburse the actual additional costs that the employee has incurred. Now, what that means is that employee has to give you as an employer certain itemized expenses which show exactly what you've been reimbursed. Now, that's quite difficult because if you're talking about additional costs such as electricity or heat and light or additional water costs, it's very, very difficult to do that sort of thing. The other thing, if you've got your mobile phone, you've been doing business expenses, you need an itemized bill. Well, it's very difficult to get an itemized bill these days. How do you then itemize that through the employer, and what sort of time period do you need to give that over, and how long will it take that employee to do that sort of thing? The second thing is, and there's a little bit of an easement here, administrative easement for employers, because they can reimburse employees at a rate of £6 per week or £27 per month without actually having any receipts. Now, this is a fantastic situation we have at the minute. Normally what you'd have is the employees working from home could have claimed £4 before the 6th of April. After the 6th of April, they can start claiming £6 per week. The other thing they can do, where there are additional costs such as a chair, extra chair or something like that, a comfortable chair, or additional costs such as there is no broadband in the house and additional broadband has been paid for, or there's been an upgrade to broadband within that organisation, that employee can actually claim the additional costs without being taxed on them. Normally, what you'd have is the additional costs would be fully taxable. So two things there. If you didn't want to reimburse the employee, that employee can claim a deduction under taxable purposes by sending in what's called a P87 form to HM Revenue and Customs, or they can do something online or call HM Revenue and Customs for the additional costs, or that £6 per week allowance. They can now claim that as a tax credit against their earned income, not only for this tax year, but for the previous 4 tax years as well. So again, there's a little bit of easement there for employees. It's not massive, it's not brilliant, it's not going to make them a millionaire, but what it does do, it does give you a chance to give your employees a little bit extra. Now, you don't need to reimburse employees. There is an argument there that some employers have put forward that says, well, actually, some employees have actually saved costs. They've saved costs by actually not coming into work. They've not been commuting, and therefore they haven't had those commuting costs. So therefore, to reimburse them for additional costs, as well as the fact that they're not actually having the commuting costs, would be a double whammy. If you didn't want to do that, there's that relief for employees. Now, the second thing is, what sort of benefits have you been providing to your employees under lockdown? And the first thing is around company cars and fuel. And if you think about it, there's been a discouragement about travel unless it's very necessary. So a lot of cars have been just sat on the drive. Now, some employees have been provided with a car and private fuel, both of which are very expensive benefits in kind. But some employers have actually taken the approach, well, if that's the case and they're not actually using it for private purposes, why don't we take that benefit in kind away for them for those times when they are either being furloughed or actually they are working at home and actually not using it, and they may have other transport options. And what that does is, remember the company car regime is changing a little bit from 6th of April. There's new tests which are actually leading to a larger benefit in kind charges, and the fuel scale charges increased as well from April. What that means is if you make that company car unavailable for a minimum of 30 days, there is no benefit in kind charge on that employee. Now, what that comes with is a range of having to prove that to HM Revenue Customs, because the end game is if you submit your P11Ds next year and there's a month or two missing from the benefit in kind charge, whereas they were expecting it to be in place, then you'd need to prove the fact that that individual didn't have the car as available for private use. And that's the key phrase. It has to be available for private use to have a benefit in kind charge. Now, to prove that, what you probably need to do is that individual either needs to hand the car back for that period or needs to hand the keys to the car back so it isn't actually possible to drive that car. In addition, what you probably need to do, if somebody has a fuel card or has been provided with fuel, private fuel, they need to hand that fuel card back, and that needs to be evidenced. If that's the case, then that benefit in kind charge will not apply to that individual for this tax year. The second thing is transport costs. And some employees may have already had a salary sacrifice in place for a season ticket, say for metro travel if you're in the Tyne area, or for travel by train if you're outside there. If it's done by salary sacrifice, what HM Revenue Customs has confirmed is that the coronavirus pandemic issue, the crisis we're having now, actually qualifies as a lifestyle event. And under a lifestyle event, what you can do is change the nature of those salary sacrifice offerings, and you can opt out of those salary sacrifice offerings for a short time period. So if you hadn't already done so and you have got that in place, you can actually do that. So again, just something to think about when we're down in lockdown and we're still not out of it yet. The third one is something around trivial benefits. And you've probably heard about this in the past, in the last 2 or 3 years, where the rules have changed, where you can provide a gift to an employee up to the value of £50, providing it's not for any incentives or any work they've actually done. You can provide that to those 2 employees. Now, what I've seen quite interesting is a lot of employers have been providing morale boosting vouchers to those employees just to keep them going under this lockdown period. It's quite difficult for some people working at home. It's quite isolating. It's nice for the employer to think about those employees. If you structure it a certain way, you can probably provide something to those employees tax-free, which actually they quite enjoy. So it's nothing they can report on the tax side of things, but it's something it's a nice thing to give, up to £50, which includes VAT. So again, that's something to think about in terms of what you can give to employees. Now, the third thing there is things around salary sacrifice, and I'll go into a little bit of detail around pensions under furlough later on. But once we're back out of lockdown, and once people are back, and once people are back out of furlough itself, pensions, some employees may have opted out of the pension regime. They may have said, actually, we want to conserve our cash. We don't want to make any payments. In addition, some employers will have paid a lower amount and reclaimed less from HM Revenue Customs from the grant claim. If that's the case, then once people get back to normal, there's a few little bits of re-enrollment to do and a little bit of rejigging around communication there so that people actually can take the salary sacrifice again. And then finally, another salary sacrifice offering is the Cycle to Work scheme. As you probably know, this is a government-approved scheme where employees can lease bicycles from their employer for a period without any tax implications arising. Now, one of the implications or one of the conditions of that scheme to apply for the tax and national insurance savings to apply is the employees need to use that bicycle for 50% of their time for a qualifying purpose. And the qualifying purpose is, one of the clues is in the name, you need to cycle to work. Now, if we've got a lot of employees here who are continuing to work from home and will continue to work from home once lockdown is over, because that's the new norm, then they will not be cycling into work. So that condition for that to apply will not continue. They will not be cycling into work for 50% of the use of that bicycle. So again, you've just got to be careful. There's a potential trap there. It won't come out as a natural investigation by HM Revenue Customs. They won't target everybody who's got a cycle to work scheme. But what I can see is that coming out in terms of a compliance review later on by the compliance team at HM Revenue Customs. And that might be a focus where people are working from home these days. And there's a little bit of rejigging around that as well. So that's the first thing, working at home. The second thing is around furlough claims, or the job retention scheme, to give it its full title. Now, first of all, what I'll say is that what a great job HM Revenue Customs have done in terms of putting this together. Within a month, they had the online portal up to date, had the legislation in place, you had the guidance in place. But obviously, it's been a little bit rushed. There's been about 4 or 5 different revisions to the guidance. There's been some revisions to the guidance this week. There will be some more probably tomorrow in terms of the extension till the end of August in the part-time work, and it's been announced already. And it's not surprising that actually that some employers would have got any claims incorrect, because they may have based it on the initial guidance when it first came out at the end of April, or they may have based it on the 4th one in the last week before the portal went online, and the legislation was issued, and also there were 2 revisions to the guidance as well. So it's quite clear that there are some employers who may have done things wrong. The other thing is the online portal does not allow you to make any amendments at the moment to any previous claims. So what that means is there could be some issues there for employers. If it's picked up by HM Revenue Customs, then they'll expect you to pay that grant claim back. Now, they have said in their guidance that they do reserve the right to carry any respective audits into any claims. And the sort of things that could go wrong, I've listed some of them there. Qualifying employees and the dates they joined. Have you got the right employees in there? What about 0-hour contracts? The terms of the furlough, have you got the agreements in place? I'm sure JP will be mentioning a few of these things later on in his talk. But has the terms of the furlough been done correctly? What about non-workers? What about those? What about the grant calculations themselves? Have you dealt with the NIC correct? The salary sacrifice and pension bonds is a really tricky one to get right. There's something the pensions regulator which I brought out as part of this. And again, have you done those correctly? Has the correct amount been paid across to the pension scheme? Has the right grant claim been done? SSP, statutory sick pay, again, that hasn't been clear from the start. That holidays has been a general question all the way through this. And also, have you worked out the part payments? Because remember, the calculations are done on calendar days rather than working days. Calendar days rather than working days. Whereas I think most payrollers work out things on 260 or 261 working days in the year rather than 365. So again, if the calculation has been on that basis and need amendments, they need to be done. What I would say is that HM Revenue Customs are allowed amendments. There is 2 really main methods to it. The first one is to brave the helpline, and I think they're quite helpful on this. Again, give praise to HM Revenue Customs, who've devoted a lot of staff to that section. But also from a chat line, there's a web chat as well, which you can amend on there. So if you have made any errors, or you want to make any changes, make those now rather than when the employer compliance review comes in place. And then finally, pension regulator scrutiny. Obviously, the pension regulator wants to make sure people have been enrolling properly. There's a 3-year period now, and also the amounts are being paid across on time and correctly and accurately. So again, just be careful about those little things there. So just an example, I won't go through it again in any great detail. These slides will be sent out after the event, so hopefully you can have a look at it there. But there's a difference of £32.41 for this employee from what goes into the pension scheme before and after furlough. If you look at the February 20, the amount paid in the pension is £119.04. After furlough, after that individual is furlough, what you have to do is gross up that amount and not a double salary sacrifice, which means you have to find out what the notional pre-salary sacrifice is under furlough and add back the employee's pension contribution and then pay over the 8%. And what that means is, I mean, pensions are hideously complicated the best of times. I don't think many employees and employers understand it, but trying to get this across to employees in terms of what is now going in the pension scheme is going to be quite difficult. So there must be some communications, I think, once people come back from furlough and then look at what's going to the pension schemes as opposed to what was in before furlough, because I think there will be a difference there and there will be questions. So it's probably best to outline that before you get to that stage. Okay, finally, the other thing to think about is around the HM customs compliance activity. I think we've seen the nicer face of HMRC since the lockdown. There's been deferral of pay-as-you-earn and IC, the monthly pay-as-you-earn and IC, and those have been agreed quite readily without actually going into any great detail. What I would say is that, remember, you can only defer the amount which hasn't been as part of your grant claim, okay? You won't be able to defer the amount you've already claimed through the grant claim. You must pay that over to HM Revenue and Customs. We've also seen a halting of compliance reviews, so postponed, and any ongoing queries. Again, they've held back from that. They'll come back through later on this year, I think, once the furlough scheme has started to wind down and the government support has gone down, and actually got a diversion of individuals from the normal jobs goes back to compliance. So again, I think just watch out for that coming through. So what are we going to think about once lockdown is actually starting to come out? Obviously, we've seen a little bit of relaxation this week and next week and the next few weeks, and hopefully from the start of July. Obviously, from a workload point of view, we're not going to get back to normal straight away. Some employers will need to have a look at their workforce to see how many they will need. They will be doing budgets at the moment to understand what will look out for the rest of the year. There will be redundancies, there's no doubt about it, and there will be terminations. They've been widely pressed. We're not sure how many that will be, but because of that, and I know that JP will mention that as part of his talk, there are some tax rules around how much tax you need to pay in termination payment situations. Now, one of those ones is around notice pay. The rules changed a couple of years ago around notice pay, and all notice pay now needs to be taxed and NIC'd. There's a little bit of a quirk there where it links in with furlough pay, about if you're in a furlough, what happens if you're made redundant in that period, what happens in notice period, how much do you have to pay? And there's a little bit of a quirk around making payments around that. So again, you need to take a little bit of advice on that because of specific changes around that. And the other thing which has come in this year from 6th of April is where you make payments above £30,000 to an employee, where you're trying to claim £30,000 tax exemption. Remember, for employees, it will always be taxable above those where you claim the exemption. But for national insurance purposes, there used to be no national insurance. From 6th of April, any payments which are made above that where you claim the exemption, there is now Class 1A national insurance. That's employers' costs of 13.8%. Okay, so just be careful if there are any termination payments above 30. And remember, statutory redundancy is always part of the £30,000 exemption. So it's where there's additional payments which are not going to be taxed above that. Okay, not pension scheme payments, anything else. Okay. Now, the other thing is changing work patterns. What that means is more increased working at home. I mentioned before. What does that mean for things such as like expenses policies? Do you have any expenses policies in place to make payments to individuals working at home? What about work related to costs? Those sort of things you need to think about, and also what sort of things you need to pay. Make it consistent across the board if you've already got it in there. What about alternative means of transport into the office? There's been a massive amount of investment in cycling announced around cycle schemes, and also widened pavements and put in place places where people can cycle in the city centres. If you are in that position, think of that cycling to work scheme. It is a great scheme. I'll also mention e-scooters as well, which I've seen they're part of this as well, which comes into it. I haven't seen a government approved scheme around that, but watch this space, I'm sure it'll come. The other thing the employers got to consider is around travel and subsistence rules. Now, HM Revenue's attitude towards home working is a bit educated. They don't really understand that individuals can work from home and what that means for travel and subsistence and temporary and permanent workplaces. What it means is, I suppose, if people are now going to be working from home, that becomes their permanent workplace, and any trip they make from home as part of a business journey can be reimbursed. Now, just have to be careful around that, because if there's an office where they are traditionally working and where they attend regularly, or where they have used to attend regularly, or which is close by, HM Revenue Customs will still see that as a permanent workplace. And they might actually see home as not a permanent workplace. So just be careful on how you categorize that, but just watch this space, because I think that might be changing in the future in terms of HMRC's attitude towards home working. The other thing is, and I put more or less in question mark self-employment, it's quite clear that the government support has been quite wide in respect of employees rather than self-employed. I think it'll go either way. I think individuals might need to be more flexible in terms of the workforce. I think that goes hand in hand with the revision and the restructuring of workforces. But I think there might be more of a nervousness to actually go be self-employed. The Chancellor did announce as part of his the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme that it wasn't fair that the self-employed were paying less than national insurance, and I think that might be looked at. So that the advantages of working as a self-employed person, people might be reduced, and also because HM revenue activity might increase in that area too. Which brings me on to that increase in HMRC activity. I've already mentioned that after lockdown, we think the regular compliance reviews will be restarted. Prior to 5th of April, I was doing a lot of talks, a lot of discussions around IR35 in the private sector, which was about to go live, which has been deferred for another year, 6th of April 2021. As part of that, HMRC were putting together quite a strong team within their Long Benton office, just to counter the IR35 situation and the employment status generally. So again, I would expect to see a lot more activity in that area coming through in this year and next. So again, just be careful about how you engage in employees and what that means for the future. Again, it's something to think about. Maybe further in the year, maybe it's less time there. And then we do expect some job retention scheme queries. I mentioned before about some issues there potentially as part of employer compliance review. I think it's unlikely that employers will just launch investigations into one aspect of the scheme. I think they'll do it as part of a regular compliance review. So if you're due to have one in the next 6 to 12 months, I would say make sure you put things in place to put things right, because it could come up as part of that. And then our old friend there, the national living wage and national minimum wage, that hasn't gone away as well. There was a slight relaxation in how they were going to approach things before the crisis hit us. Again, I can't see any change to how they're going to approach reviews into national minimum wage. So I think, again, just be careful on some of the technical details of that. It's often inadvertent issues that have tripped employers up, interpretations of the rules and how we've done that. So just again, there's been a change in terms of the rates that are due to be paid. Obviously, there were some rules around furlough and of apprentices, around training and what you need to do with that. Just be careful with that one and just recheck how we've dealt with those. And again, just the 6th of July is when the P11Ds for 1920. Wow, we've gone through a tax year. They need to be submitted by the 6th of July. So that still needs to go in. There's been no relaxation of those submission dates. It's probably wise to have a review at the minute, just to have a look through your expenses and benefits for that last tax year, because also the pay-as-you-earn settlement agreement, or PSA for short, they need to be done by the end of July as well. And we're nearly into June now, so it doesn't leave you a lot of time to do that. It needs to be looked at. So just have a look at that as part of that. And I think I've put at the bottom, normal service resumes. I think that's clear for a lot of things, but particularly for compliance. I think HMRC will be looking to get as much as possible in through the door to reduce that debt in the country. And I think they'll be looking for employers to contribute their fair share here. I think that's the end of my piece. I think I'm going to be on the buttons just to take the slides through, but I'll pass you on now to JP van Zyl. I'll stop my video, and the next person you'll see is JP.
Thank you, Lee, for inviting me to participate. A lot is unclear at the moment, so there's a lot of speculation. I had considered driving to Barnard Castle because I understand that the vision from there is a lot clearer of the future. But then I remembered that we weren't supposed to travel unless it was essential. So as far as the furlough schemes concerned, we're as we are until the end of July. 3-week stints, and the current rules continue to apply. I suspect tomorrow further guidance will be issued. These things usually are issued on a Friday afternoon, which will confirm the extension of the furlough scheme until October, and will then provide us with some additional detail as to flexibility and also the rate at which those costs can be reclaimed under the grant scheme. My understanding is that there will be additional flexibility. The rumours currently are that the flexibility will be limited to folks that are currently on furlough, and so there may be limited ability to introduce new staff to the furlough scheme. Once those guidance is available, then we'll summarise that for you, and we can distribute that, and no doubt there'll be a whole raft of queries or questions arising. The two questions, or the three issues, I guess, that we are dealing with most frequently in relation to furlough are probably around annual leave. You know, we'd all anticipated the furlough scheme lasting for something like 3 months. You know, it's now potentially until the end of October. Massive amounts of annual leave are being accrued. Folks generally aren't taking them. There was, you know, uncertainty as to whether people could take them or could be required to take them even. And then at which rates payment should be made. It's now clear that annual leave continues to accrue even for staff on furlough. They can take their holidays as they wish, applying for them in the usual way. And I think it's now also clearer that employers can require employees to take some of the annual leave that they accrue whilst they're on furlough. I think it would probably be unfair, and general commentary, I think, is in favour of this proposition, or in agreement with this proposition, that it would be unfair to run down large blocks of annual leave. So, for example, to require people to take 2 or 3 weeks of their annual entitlement, which you would then fund in part under the furlough scheme. But I think a couple of days a month is absolutely fine. The received wisdom is that that holiday should be paid at normal rates of pay. So that's 100% pay rather than the 80% which we reclaim from the government. But bear in mind that principle related to normal pay applies to the first 4 weeks of any annual leave entitlement, whereas most people generally receive more generous contractual entitlements, and that more generous proportion can be paid at the lower 80%. So I guess from a practical perspective, bearing in mind we're, you know, at the end of May, there's nothing wrong with distinguishing those two types of leave and then requiring people to take holidays, which you will simply fund at 80%. And I dare say, even if it's at 100%, at least you're still receiving, I think, the 80% contribution from the government. There is an amendment to the working time regulations, which means that holidays can be carried over for 2 calendar years, which in some part addresses nervousness about employees accruing large amounts of holiday, which they will then need to take in the 6 months to the end of this calendar year. Another regulation to the amendment to the statutory sick pay regulations was announced today, related to tracing. And if individuals are informed of the need to self-isolate for 14 days, having come into contact with a colleague or an acquaintance or a family member who is suffering from the coronavirus, then those 14 days spent in self-isolation would be entitled to claim statutory sick pay. So these clearly are people who have returned to work, because we now know that those who are suffering from ill health on furlough can continue to receive grants under the furlough scheme. Another query that has arisen is in relation to notice pay, which we will come back to in due course when we get to the further slides. So, returning to work, we've had a number of conversations with a number of clients over the last few weeks. Folks are increasingly focusing on returning to work and the steps that they should take to address concerns and deal with with caring responsibilities and reluctance to return to work. And there's a wide range, I think, of circumstances that might apply. I think every reasonable employer is probably surveying their staff to try and understand what their personal circumstances are. So, for example, whether they have caring responsibilities, whether they might be shielding, whether they themselves might be vulnerable, whether there are other reasons, for example, why they might be reluctant to return to work, and generally what their flexibility is in terms of work. A number of clients are saying to us that, you know, they don't anticipate, not only because of social distancing, but also because of commercial activity, resuming at full rate. And so they're very much requiring some staff to return in drips and drabs. And so the fact that some staff might be reluctant to return to work, or perhaps because of their family circumstances not quite ready, quite suits some employers, because it allows them to leave these folks on furlough, whilst requesting some of the colleagues, perhaps who are more readily able to return to work, to do that in order to explore opening and to deal with initial commercial queries that they receive. There is on our website, and that's a link on the slide there, to a survey or a questionnaire. Sorry, if you just go back to the previous one, to the questionnaire which is on site. As far as returning to work, you know, ultimately it's a work for pay bargain. The discretion as to put people on furlough is one for the employer. From a health and safety perspective, the obligation is to take such steps as are reasonably practicable. So that doesn't mean you need to reduce all possible risk. You know, and if you are confronted, and this isn't made up, this was an employer client who was confronted with this particular sentiment, was, you know, I'm not returning to work until we have a vaccine. Well, you know, once furlough ends, there needs to be a justifiable reason for not returning to work. And either, you know, it's statutory sick pay, or you could agree annual leave, or you could agree a period of unpaid leave, possibly. Particularly where an employer has acquitted themselves of their statutory duties. Now, we need to be mindful that the government has done an exceedingly good job of scaring people, and in the media, of course. And of course, people are fearful for their safety and their welfare, and of course, the welfare and the safety of their families. And so some time and care has to be taken around risk assessments, around safe systems of work, and about a proper induction and training schedule, which we deal with in the following slide. So, as I've said, initial considerations relate principally to, on the one hand, commercial considerations. You know, what is the need of the business? How many folks do you need to return to work? Now, whether that's working from home, working remotely, or, you know, at an office or a factory. And it's then trying to time the return of people to coincide with, hopefully, an uptick in demand. You know, what we were faced with at the end of March and end of April was literally a cliff face with the furlough scheme. Hopefully that blow will now have been softened. I'm rather hopeful that as more of us are able to return to work, commercial activity will increase, which will increase the need for people to continue to be productive. Information as to steps that employers are taking to ensure that they are able to provide a safe place of work is tremendously important. Consultation, I think, is not only advisable, but it's also a statutory requirement. There's a statutory requirement to inform and consult not just the workers directly, but any health and safety forum that you might have set up, either because of a collective agreement or because of some kind of workplace council you might have in place. And then induction and training. You know, we need to inform people of what the risk assessments are. We need to bring them back to the workplace. We need to give them some chance to familiarize themselves with the new processes. And of course, all of that can be done whilst people are on furlough. You know, absolutely fine to leave people on furlough, and whilst they are acquainting themselves with the relevant steps that you are taking to ensure that they are safe, your clients are safe, and the general members of the public are safe. The other side to this coin of health and safety is monitoring and ensuring that people comply. My understanding is that, you know, people very quickly become quite lackadaisical about maintaining social distancing, and employers need to demonstrate that they're taking it seriously. And I've had conversations with a number of employers around disciplinary sanctions and how those are implemented. So, for example, a client can't use all of their staff in the manufacturing process for the moment, and so they've appointed a couple of those staff members who they can't put to use as monitors, and the monitors ensure that people move around the factory in the right way, that they are adhering to social distancing, etc. And where difficulties are arising, then they are dealing with those under the terms of their disciplinary processes. I think it's important that folks also introduce a mechanism for employees to raise concerns. You all would have looked at the government guidance and you would have seen the encouragement to contact the HSE in the event queries arise, and clearly employers want to avoid that. There's also, I think, a temptation to raise grievances. And again, bearing in mind, those are 2 or 3 stage processes that will clog up systems. So I think every return to work procedure should have a very easy process for employees to raise concerns, which could be dealt with in real time, add real value, and won't clog up your internal processes. There's another link on that particular slide to a case that deals with detriment. Now, where an employee has a reasonable opinion that his or her health and safety is at imminent risk of harm, and he or she suffers a detriment as a result, or is dismissed as a consequence of refusing to work, that dismissal is automatically unfair. And the example that's referred to in the link, which you'll find on our website, relates to slightly different circumstances, but the principles are the same. So a number of people who refused to travel to work because of adverse weather conditions. A road had been shut and they refused to use the road despite being provided with 4x4 transport. And because they refused to work, the employer refused to pay them for the day, quite reasonably, you might think. But because their objection and because the detriment they'd suffered, i.e. not being paid for the day's wage, was as a consequence of them having a reasonable opinion that their health was at serious and imminent risk of jeopardy, the tribunal found that the non-payment of their wages was an unlawful detriment. So the only way that employers can avoid those arguments arising is by properly engaging with staff, informing them of the steps we're taking, consulting with them exhaustively, and then I think a proper process of induction and training. And then the next slide deals with changing terms and conditions of employment. You know, the gold standard there is achieving agreement, and the best way, again, of doing that is by consulting with staff. You know, and that might be a change around starting times, end times of shifts. It might be about changing the times of shifts or the manner in which overtime's paid or not paid for that matter. You know, all these little changes to a place of work, for example, or the current terms of the furlough scheme, or indeed, you know, where you've agreed to reduce pay for staff who are actively working. Again, that would probably have occurred via agreement. Where we can't achieve agreement and you want to enforce those changes unilaterally, then any consultations which you embark on generally fall within the ambit of the same law that applies to collective consultation for a redundancy point of view. And so please do bear in mind that you will need to take account of people who are affected potentially by changes to terms and conditions in just the same way that you will need to take account of those who are potentially at risk of being made redundant. The reason this is important is because where these changes, whether it's a change to terms which is being objected to and you want to make that change unilaterally, or where you're proposing to make dismissals because of redundancy, where the numbers involved are larger than 20, then there's an obligation to comply with collective consultation requirements, which deals with appointing reps, consulting with those reps, sharing information with them and consulting with them. The sting in the tail is that if one does not comply with those collective consultation requirements, then a tribunal could make a punitive sanction, which is equal to 90 days pay. Now, those consultations need to last for at least 30 or 45 days, depending on the number of people that we are proposing to make redundant before the first dismissals take effect. So if it's larger than 20, it's 30 days. If it's larger than 100 people, then it's at least 45 days. Now, if we're looking ahead towards the furlough scheme coming to an end, then we can see that, there's a very real risk of a very large fixed cost reverting to the business. And so businesses are currently looking at what their capacity looks like, and they are actively considering whether or not they require the full staff complement to return to work, whether they will indeed require them over the next 3, 6, 12 months. And where there's a question mark about that, people are starting the consultation processes now. There's nothing wrong with consulting with people whilst they're on furlough. And indeed, there's, again, nothing wrong with issuing notice and people serving out their notice periods whilst they're on furlough. Clearly, you can't make payments in lieu of notice whilst on furlough. Similarly, you can't fund redundancy pay on furlough. There's some conversations around what the rate of pay should be whilst notice is being served. And the general rule of thumb is that where it's statutory minimum notice, then it needs to be at normal pay. But where the contractual entitlement is at least 1 week more favourable, then it could be at the current rate of pay, i.e. the furlough rate. But because collective redundancies are such a fraught area and so complicated, I would absolutely advise you to take advice in the event you are considering them, not just in relation to the timing, but also in relation to the processes. And I think that might bring an end to my slot. And so if there are any questions, then please do feel free to pass those on.
Right, well, thank you very much, JP, and thank you, Lee. When I do the UNW charity briefings at Citygate, I normally like to try and start these on the hour and finish within the hour. I'm looking at my clock here on the kitchen wall. I think it's about 6 minutes to 5. We've had quite a few questions through the session, and we also had some questions in advance. So what I'm actually going to do is try and get through some of those questions in the allotted time. And you'll see that Lee's and JP's contact details are both on screen. If we don't get to answer your question, if you wouldn't mind resending the question to either Lee or JP afterwards, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer. I think only one person of the questions who've been asked during the session has actually put their name. We seem to have got a lot of anonymous attendees, so I don't know whether that's the same anonymous attendee who's asked all the questions or whether it's different anonymous attendees. But anyway, first question for Lee. Lee, one of the attendees has asked, if we can't get the car or the car keys back and the fuel card is being used and can be evidenced through the bills, can you reduce the benefit for fuel only when payrolling benefits?
Wow, that's a very specific question, isn't it?
I thought so. I mean, is that one, do you think it might be better to ask the sender if they would like to send it to you after the webinar, and then you can deal with it then, and then if there's a supplementary question, because one of the problems with online questions, if we were doing this to an audience, and I know from experience, the attendee will ask the question, you give an answer, and the attendee will ask a bit more. So
yes, could I take the coward's advisor's way out and just ask them to then I'll come back to, because I think there's quite a few variables to that one, I think.
Yeah, that's what I thought with the question. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll move on. I'll take these next two together because they both are around the £6 per week that you were talking about during the session. So the first one is this employer has got some employees who are now working from home 2 to 3 days per week, but they're still coming into the office to work for a couple of days. And the question is, would they still be entitled to claim the £6 per week, given if that's the situation? So it's some of the week working from home and some week in the office. And while you're thinking about that, there's a question from another attendee. If we were to pay the £6 per week to employees for working from home, would you recommend that being put through as an expenses claim, or should we just pay it through the payroll?
I think for the first one, I think yes, you can give that. There is some new legislation which has just come out just to ease that £6 per week. So you can, even though there's a split between 2 and 3 days in and out of the office, because of where we are at the minute and the crisis we're in, the revenue have eased that just for this period. They have brought some legislation in, which temporary legislation is in as well, regarding additional expenses which are paid for after the 11th of June. But where it's before the 11th of June, they'll not actually collect the tax and national insurance, which may have been due on those expenses. So that was the first one. What was the second question around whether you put it through the payroll?
Yes, so if you were to pay the £6 per week allowance, should you be treating that as if it's like an expenses claim from the employee, or should you just pay it through the payroll? I mean, obviously, it's not going to be, if you pay it through the payroll, it's not going to be taxed, is it? So no.
It's not going to be taxed. So you could either pay it through your expense system, or you could pay it through the payroll. What I would say is you don't need any evidence for that £6 per week. You can pay it regardless. So it doesn't need to go through the expenses, if you see what I mean. You don't need evidence for that.
Yeah. Okay. This is actually a question that was asked before the session, so maybe I should have taken this one first. This is to do with expenses, so this is another question for Lee. Following the government's instructions, we've got as many staff working from home as we can, and we've had to pay for one staff member to buy a Wi-Fi booster for their home, as the signal strength isn't strong enough to allow them to work efficiently and use video calling from their spare room at home. And the same employer has also had to purchase an office chair for another member of staff. And the question for both of them is, is this a benefit in kind? And I suppose in the question of the chair is, if the chair ends up staying at home, sort of after the sort of normality has returned, and so I don't know if you can quickly.
Yeah. I mean, the Wi-Fi booster. What you've got there is an additional cost of the employee to work from home. So even though you may have broadband, it may not reach the office or the room that employee wants it to reach. So in that situation, the revenue would allow that as being tax-free and not taxable. The office chair. As I mentioned before, there's new legislation out which actually exempts those items, household items which have been purchased or reimbursed to an employee. Now that takes place from the 11th of June, so it doesn't really help from now. But what HM Revenue and Customs have said, between the 23rd of March and the 11th of June, they will not look to collect any tax or national insurance on those expenses. So effectively tax-free. So both of those, good news.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that, Lee. I think as it is now 5 o'clock, according to my kitchen clock, I'm going to draw to a close there. But just to repeat, Lee's and JP's details are on screen. So do please email any questions that we haven't dealt with in the session, or any other questions that come to mind, because I don't know about you, I often think of questions about 5 minutes after everybody's disappeared. So I'm going to wrap up the session. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'm sorry I can't see you. I hope you found it interesting, informative. Today's presentation wouldn't have been possible without the backup team from UNW. So that's Maxine, Richard and Daniel, and Charlotte and Claire from Square One Law. Some of you I know are from the charity not-for-profit sector, and we are doing another lockdown, Life After Lockdown webinar next Thursday at 10 o'clock. And the final thing I'd like to say before we finish is Maxine will be sending out some feedback forms later on this evening, I think. And if you could complete those and send those back, we'd be very grateful. So thank you very much again for attending. Thank you to our two speakers. And I will now imagine that everybody is joining me in a round of applause for Lee and JP. Thank you very much.